Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Toast and Topics. The Olympic Games closed out in Paris last week, and that's what inspired us to look at the topic of this week's episode, which will be a deep dive into the economics of hosting the Olympic Games.
That's right. And I'm sad that the games are done. They were actually really captivating this year. And I don't really recall an Olympics that was ever this close with the gold medal count tied between the US and China. I managed to catch some of the tennis. I saw that Turkish shooter that everyone is memeing about. And I was even more impressed by breakdancing, which was just super fun to watch.
Yeah, and you're a pretty good dancer, Sachin, so I'm sure that you could make a push to compete on the US team over the course of one of these years.
Ben, I somehow think that would be a bad idea. I don't even think that I could dance like that in my wildest dreams. So for now, I think it might be best I stick to podcasting.
No, this is unfortunately fair. Economics probably is our specialty, and that's exactly what we were thinking about when we were watching these games. The stadiums that were constructed for the Paris Games were incredible. The infrastructure that was improved throughout Paris to accommodate tourists was also impressive. And both the opening and the closing ceremonies were highly memorable and presumably extremely expensive. So that's a good segue into this week's topic. The Olympics are among the biggest events that a country can get the honor of hosting, but at the same time, it's really somewhat burdensome. And ultimately, it's going to be interesting to examine that through an economic lens. So we'll structure this episode into a few sections here. First, we'll examine the cost of hosting the Olympics for a given country. We'll then discuss the cases for and against hosting the games. And we'll finally conclude with some potential ideas that have floated around to make the Olympic Games more economically and environmentally viable in the future. So, Sachin, do you want to start us off here? What does it actually cost to host an Olympic Games?
So it's no surprise that the Olympics are costly. The cost of hosting the Paris Games was estimated at around $9.7 billion, and around half of that bill was being footed by France and their local and national governments. And just to put this in perspective, Paris hosted the games 100 years ago in 1924. And the games at that time cost just $9 million to host, adjusted to 2022 prices. The funniest part of all this is that the Paris Games are, in fact, likely to go down as some of the most economical in recent history. Many countries have spent far more on their own games in the past. For example, the 2022 Winter Games hosted by Beijing cost an estimated $39 billion, which was four times the total spent by Paris. And costs reached a staggering $50 billion for the Olympic Games that were hosted in Russia about 10 years ago.
That's pretty staggering. And just to put that into perspective here, this costs more than many large-scale infrastructure projects. For example, the Beijing-Shanghai Railroad project comes close to the $50 billion mark, but that's a 1,300-kilometer long high-speed rail line. And more than that, the cost of hosting an Olympic Games can often go far over what countries expect them to be. A good example here is the 1976 Summer Olympics in Montreal. The projected cost there of $124 million was in fact billions below what the actual cost wound up being, largely due to construction delays and cost overruns for a new stadium. That saddled taxpayers in Montreal with 1.5 billion in debt that took nearly 3 decades to pay off. In fact, the Olympics as a category of infrastructure spending tends to have an average cost overrun of 195% versus initial projections. And that's second only to nuclear storage projects, which is not an ideal comparator.
That's really interesting. And I'm thinking back to our nuclear power episode. Why is it so expensive to host the games, given that most of the infrastructure that's being built, at least on paper, seems fairly standard stuff, so to speak?
Yeah, there are a couple reasons for this. The first is that even if the infrastructure that's being built is fairly standard stuff, it is expensive, fairly standard stuff. If a city wins a bid to host an Olympics, they'll need to ensure that they have adequate facilities for roughly 300 events for the Summer Olympics and 100 events if they're hosting the Winter Olympics. Not only that, they also are going to need to build out the necessary infrastructure for the potentially hundreds of thousands of tourists who will visit once the games begin. And that means improving rail and public transit systems, accommodations, restaurants, and more. The second reason is that competition to host the Olympic Games has really been pretty fierce. The International Olympic Committee has often entertained up to a dozen bids from cities hoping to host the Olympics. And as such, they kind of have the luxury of selecting the cities with the most elaborate and expensive plans. Now, this may become less of an issue in future years. As we'll discuss more soon, the costs of hosting the Olympics have become high enough that there seem to have become fewer bidders. For example, only Paris and Los Angeles bidded for the 2024 and 2028 Olympics, whereas by comparison, there were three bidding cities that made it to the voting stage for the summer 2020 Olympics and four bidding cities that made it to the voting stage for the 2016 Summer Olympics. And so the reduced competition that we could be seeing in the future may mean that cities can kind of curtail some of these elaborate plans and stop building as many facilities. Again, that remains to be seen, though.
So, with all that in mind, I think it's interesting to now think about why countries even host the games to begin with. And the upside of hosting the Olympics is pretty straightforward. The host country does get infrastructure that could be used in the future. They get positive PR, and they get an influx of tourists and tourism revenue. In terms of infrastructure, hosting the Olympics require investment in large scale and specialized sports stadiums that you mentioned, Ben. And on top of that, it requires athlete accommodations in Olympic Village, transportation infrastructure such as rail and bus lines, and national security improvements as well in surveillance, as an example. Um, and there's also many other considerations to ensure that the games go smoothly, such as expanding investment in healthcare and energy, all of which can be positive for the country's citizens long after the games. Um, the Olympics can also be a major boost to PR for countries. Just some statistics here. Through the 13 days of the Olympics, viewership in Paris was up 76% over the Tokyo Games. And this is something that stood out to me when I was doing some research here. If the Summer Olympics were an original streaming series, it would rank second behind only Bridgerton in terms of total viewing time this year. So it just shows that it creates a lot of interest in a given host country and the games that go along with it. All of this can be a major boost to public opinion ratings. And, when you think about Paris, it's pretty remarkable to see how the games completely shifted the conversation around France, which had been in focus just a few months earlier for its tumultuous politics, which now seem to be forgotten by most. And then finally, there's a large amount of revenue potential for hosting the games in terms of ticket sales, advertising sponsorships, and broadcasting rights. Broadcasting rights are actually the biggest revenue generator of the games, where the International Olympic Committee sells over $4.5 billion just in terms of broadcasting rights. Ticket sales for events, for the opening and closing ceremonies, and other related activities also generate substantial revenue. In Tokyo, for example, these added up to over $800 million. And keep in mind that this was just substantially lower due to COVID. However, I think what's really interesting and what really makes it into the pockets of these host cities when all said and done are really other ancillary revenues that surround the games. The influx of tourists that come in to watch the games can lead to increases in spending for accommodations, for food, for transportation, and other forms of entertainment, which indirectly boost local revenue. But it's important to keep in mind that this is much more variable and depends largely on who's competing, how it's been advertised, and frankly, public interest, which has been mixed and has varied from year to year.
Interesting.
So this is all, I think, a good time to pivot and to start talking about actually the case against the Olympics. And I think there are some stats, Ben, that you've mentioned in terms of dwindling interest in the Olympics.
Yeah, yeah. Just as an example here, 44% of Parisians consider the Olympic Games to be a quote bad thing, and 50% said that they would consider leaving the city to escape the games given the potential disruption to daily life. Even more interestingly, only two cities, as I mentioned earlier, bidded for this year's Olympic Games. And so there seems to be this sort of burnout among many countries that are involved in hosting the games. And I think that goes back to our earlier discussion on costs, which seems to be, a reason that people are understandably skeptical of the value of hosting an Olympics. Not only have there been a significant number of cost overruns, there has also been this major issue of debt. Many cities have found themselves with a financial hangover of sorts. As I mentioned, the 1976 Summer Games in Montreal left a huge amount of debt for the city, such that the Big O Stadium that they built became renamed by locals to be the Big O Stadium, spelled OWE, just because of how much the stadium cost. Greece is another good example here. The country spent $11 billion on its Olympic Games in 2004, which research subsequently shown to have contributed adversely to the country's debt crisis around 5 to 6 years later. Ultimately, one of the big problems here is just that the infrastructure that's used during the Olympic Games is often not productivity enhancing, and it rarely gets used afterward. In Rio, for example, 12 out of the 27 venues that were built to host the Olympics there in 2016 failed to host another sporting event in the decade following.
That's a really good point. And I've read that efforts have been made to curb this overspending and over construction in Paris. And they've really tried their best to minimize the burden on the public sector. In fact, 96% of its operational costs, excluding infrastructure spending, were actually handled by the private sector. And for Paris, they actively tried to build housing in historically low-income neighborhoods where many buildings will ultimately be converted into mixed income housing after the games. But nonetheless, the poor historical track record of both cost overruns and long-term debt burdens certainly seem like a deterring factor for countries to host.
Yeah, that's for sure. And that brings me to my next point about the economic impact of hosting the games and the fact that it seems to be pretty mixed. In 2016, for example, a review of studies found that the impact of the games had basically a near zero short-term effect, and that the long-run effects of hosting the games economically are really at best, quote, elusive. In fact, 10 of the 13 summer games that were hosted until 2016 resulted in economic losses for the host country. And the biggest problem I'll highlight here is that the economic impact of the Olympics is largely concentrated on the short term. Think about all the jobs that are created here, ranging from hotel workers to security guards to chefs to cook meals for Olympians and more. It's really a massive inflow, but the reality is that this is only an inflow that will last for about a month. The Olympics aren't really generating a lot of sustainable economic activity that can benefit residents of the cities that are hosting them for years to come.
The final angle that we haven't touched upon yet that I found pretty interesting was the environmental impact of hosting the games. The games in Rio and London, for example, each produced more than 3 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is roughly equal to the annual emissions of Iceland, which is a country of about 380,000 people. And the reason for this is that every time that a new infrastructure project has to be built that didn't previously exist, it creates more CO2 emissions. When you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Construction of new sports venues or athletes' villages or transportation infrastructure all require clearing large areas of land before any progress is made. And at the start, that can lead to large-scale deforestation, a loss of natural habitats, and a disruption of local ecosystems. And for this reason, as the world has become more environmentally conscious, there's also been a growing push by the International Olympic Committee to prioritize bids from countries that require minimal new infrastructure. And one idea that's actually been floated around, which I thought to be pretty fascinating, is to actually spread the Olympics out across multiple cities to host different events where they already have existing infrastructure. And for economists, at least, this is the surest way to cut costs. If you have more places spending on events, it would mean a smaller bill for each of them. And a multi-city model could also help calm local concerns by reducing the pressure on any single host country for an influx of everything that we mentioned earlier. And this was already happening somewhat in Paris, for example. The basketball and handball matches took place in Lille, which is a town about 140 miles away from Paris. And surfing was in Tahiti, which is 10,000 miles away. So small efforts are being made to move in this direction. And I think it'll be interesting to see if that's where the games head in the longer term.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it also, I think, might ameliorate some of the political concerns that many have around the Olympics. Just in that, if you have a games hosted entirely in one city or one country, those games can be used as a propaganda tool by the city or country that's doing the hosting. I think there was a lot of criticism of the Olympics in China and Russia for those reasons, and by spreading out the games, I could see that concern being limited. Ultimately, though, looking ahead, Los Angeles is slated to host the next Summer Olympics in 2028, and boding well for the city. They were one of the only host cities that was actually able to turn a profit on an Olympic Games that they hosted. This was back in 1984 for Los Angeles. And I'm sure that the planners of the Olympics there are thinking about many of these same issues, just in terms of how to reduce costs. And really only time will tell how those issues are going to be addressed in a sustainable way by future hosts.
Yeah, I hope that the planners subscribe to Toast and Topics and listen to this episode before making any decisions.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think, hopefully they will and benefit from it. So thank you all for joining us for today's conversation. We hope you learned something new and enjoyed the games. And next episode, Sachin and I are going to be focusing on the state of California's recent push to restrict cell phone use in classrooms. And more broadly, we'll be discussing the impact of technology on young people. Until then.
Thanks for listening to Toast and Topics. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and follow us on the podcasting platform of your choice. And if you didn't like what you heard, please share it with a friend or family member to see if they might feel differently. In any case, we'll be around. See you again next time.